Everybody, thank you for joining us this week in America and the Blue Funk Broadcasting Radio Network. Great to have you with us. Website thisweekinamerica.us. On the program today, as mentioned in the introduction, we're talking about something that's a prevalent problem. I've done TV shows on this over the years, and I understand the problem is probably more prevalent today than it even was when we started talking about this, maybe 15, 20 years ago. Dr. Sari Fine-Shepherd is our guest on the program, a clinical psychologist, eating disorder specialist, and author of 100 Questions and Answers about Anorexia Nervosa. Dr. Shepherd, welcome to This Week in America. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Rick. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's our pleasure, and we're going to talk about several things here. We're going to talk about anorexia, bulimia, and compulsive eating disorders. And let's start by basically defining each of those, and then we'll get into some specifics here. What anorexia, exactly what are we talking about with that?
Sure. Well, anorexia is one of the two main eating disorders that we see in practice. Anorexia is characterized by a refusal to maintain body weight at what's expected for someone's weight range for their age and height. So we see significant weight loss with anorexia, and we typically see either self-imposed starvation or we see the ingesting of calories but then compensating for those calories through some unhealthy means, either self-induced vomiting or excessive exercising really to the point of exhaustion, or laxative abuse. And so there's unhealthy diet behaviors that take place in anorexia, but it results in significant weight loss. And then once that weight loss results, a person either isn't able to put the weight back on or refuses to do so. And also with anorexia, we see a disturbance in one's body image, where even though a person with anorexia might be severely emaciated, they still look at themselves in the mirror thinking that they're fat. So there's a distortion in the way that they perceive their bodies.
Why is that? Because again, in the programs we've done in referring to some of the people, Karen Carpenter for one, others over the course of history that we've known, these are people that are not large in any sense of the word, but yet they seem to see themselves as not having the body image they want. Why is that? Why is that disconnect there?
That's right. Well, anorexia nervosa is a psychiatric illness. It is a mental illness. So there are components of distortion in someone's thinking when it comes to their weight and their body image. And so many people don't understand that anorexia is not a lifestyle choice. People don't choose to have this illness, but it is a mental disorder, a mental illness. And so that's one of the reasons that we see that distortion, because there is a problem in thinking and in perception.
Now let's go back to bulimia. Let's define that and what the difference is between bulimia and anorexia.
Sure. Well, actually, many of the symptoms with bulimia and anorexia are similar, where we see that distortion in body image. We see a concern with weight gain. In both of those illnesses, there's a real fear of gaining any sort of weight. But with bulimia, a person will be more at a normal weight range or even slightly above a normal weight range. So while they may engage in some self-imposed starvation, some binge eating and purging, their weight will be more within the normal weight range. Now, some people with anorexia do binge eat, and that is something that people might not understand, that people with anorexia often do eat, but they will compensate for their calories and maintain that severe weight loss. But with bulimia nervosa, binge eating is a hallmark of the illness. So to be diagnosed with bulimia, one is typically engaging in binge eating and then purging of those calories on a regular basis.
That's interesting because you say that basically 40 to 60% of people with anorexia will go through that binging, and I thought that was pretty much limited to bulimia, but it's not.
Yeah, that's a common misconception, and actually there's a lot of crossover in diagnosis between anorexia and bulimia because the symptoms are so similar. Once someone regains their weight with anorexia, if their symptoms continue, then their diagnosis just changes to bulimia.
Let's talk about compulsive overeating. Explain that.
Compulsive overeating is actually diagnosed as binge eating disorder. That's the diagnostic term. And that really refers to people who have a difficulty stopping eating once they begin. They express a lack of control over their eating. So they may eat a large amount of calories in a very short amount of time, but also express that they feel like they cannot control that behavior. So frequently, whether it's daily, several times daily or several times weekly, they will have that binge episode where they ingest a lot of calories. But the difference with binge eating disorder or compulsive overeating is that there's not the compensation for those calories. So the unhealthy diet behaviors don't exist with binge eating.
You mentioned body image, and that plays such a key role in this, at least from the psychological standpoint. And in the book, you talk about body image, and it is 3 core elements of body image. Explain that to us.
Sure. Well, body image really is the way that one thinks about one's own body, both the way that they perceive it when they look in the mirror, and also the way they think about their body when they just imagine themselves being in their body, just imagining whether a person would experience their body in a way that incorporates health, incorporates the recognition of what their body does for them as an instrument, or whether they just focus mainly on how their body appears. And so body image really encompasses not only how one thinks about their appearance, but also how one feels in their body. And then the third component is how one expects others perceive their body. So someone with a positive body image will generally assume that most people assume that their bodies, that most other people perceive their bodies to be of a normal weight and height. But someone with a negative body image will be much more self-conscious and often assume that others disapprove of their bodies, even if their bodies are of a normal weight and height.
You're listening to This Week in America on the Blue Funk Broadcasting Radio Network, website thisweekinamerica.us. You can log on and link on to our guest on the program today, Dr. Sari Fine Shepherd, author of the book 100 Questions and Answers About Anorexia Nervosa. Or you can go directly to her website, which is drshep.com. That's DrShepp.com, and get all the information. The book is 100 Questions and Answers About Anorexia Nervosa. It's available all across the country. You can order online as well. You know, you got an interesting story. You start off in the foreword of the book talking about a young lady, 16 when she was first diagnosed, Anna Weston. Let's talk a little bit about her case, because this, from what I understand, is pretty typical of how it begins. She thought she had it conquered. She didn't. There was a relapse and, unfortunately, a tragic ending. But let's go back and talk about Anna's situation. She's 16 when she's diagnosed. Is that right about the median age where people are diagnosed?
It is. With anorexia nervosa, about 85 to 90% of cases begin before the age of 18. And that's really because the timing of anorexia coincides with puberty and the changes that take place during puberty. For the most part, there are adult-onset cases of anorexia, but for the most part, we see anorexia develop corresponding to the physical changes that take place during puberty. Many young teens are uncomfortable with the amount of weight that they gain, and they might not realize that it's actually normal for teens, both boys and girls, to double their weight in just a short amount of time because of the changes that take place in puberty. And Anna, unfortunately, was one who experienced her weight gain and the changes of her body in a way that made her very uncomfortable. And, you know, she just started by innocently wanting to diet to lose a few pounds. That's something that we see pretty consistently, is that most cases of eating disorders begin with a simple diet. However, we know from studies that about 35% of regular dieters go on to what we call pathological dieting, where there's some unhealthy weight loss behaviors involved, whether it's purging or laxative abuse or self-imposed starvation or excessive exercise. And of those 35% of unhealthy dieters, a full 25% go on to develop clinical eating disorders. And that is unfortunately what happened with Anna, that she started on an innocent diet, or seemingly an innocent diet, and she ended up losing her life to anorexia nervosa. And I can't emphasize enough the risks involved with anorexia, because a full 20% of people who are diagnosed with the illness will die from the illness.
That's an amazing statistic.
It really is. It's shocking, and I can't emphasize enough just the importance of understanding the severity, because even those who don't perish from the illness may end up with severe consequences that can affect the course of their life, such as infertility and disturbance in organ function, and including psychological and social consequences as well.
Well, you go through some of the physical problems that you have in the book, 100 Questions and Answers About Anorexia Nervosa, and it is very harmful, obviously, to your body. Now, her mother wrote the foreword, and she's saying, if we only would have known the warning signs. And like you say, so many kids during that time, it's like, okay, prom is coming up or something special is coming up. I want to drop a few pounds. What are some of the warning signs when parents and even friends should say, this more than just losing a couple of pounds?
That's a great question. And, you know, some of the warning signs that I mentioned may sound like typical behaviors for both teens and adults across the country. Yeah. But it's still important to pay attention when you see these early warning signs, just to check in, because even with some of these early warning signs, they can be a signal of stress or other issues like anxiety that are going on. So even if there's not an eating disorder, it's a great idea just to check in. But some of the early warning signs would be worrying about weight gain, beginning to speak negatively about one's own body, perhaps calling themselves fat, comparing themselves to their friends or to role models that we see in society who are intensely thin, having a difficulty eating around others and beginning to eat more just by themselves and in isolation, beginning to restrict their food, severely dieting, weighing themselves several times a day, or obsessing about certain areas of the body, complaining that perhaps stomach or hips or thighs or buttocks are too big. And then sometimes we see that excessive exercise begin, where one of the women who contributes her story to my book talks about the fact that she enjoyed running and she began to run a little bit more just to lose a few pounds, but she ended up running dozens of miles a day and then couldn't stop. She compulsively had to keep running, ended up with anorexia, and nearly lost her life to it, but fortunately she recovered.
Well, and you talk about the female athlete triad. Explain that to us.
The female athlete triad is something that we see, in particular in female athletes, where when we see one hallmark of these three particular behaviors, we always want to check for the other two, because the three behaviors of eating disorders and osteoporosis and amenorrhea, or in other words, losing one's period for at least 3 months, they tend to go together. And female athletes often don't realize that in order to have healthy menstruation, they need a certain percentage of body fat. And when an athlete goes below that percentage of body fat, it can affect their periods, and it can also be a hallmark for these other two behaviors, or these other two consequences, both eating disorders and also early osteoporosis. So losing one's period is not healthy even for an athlete, even for an elite athlete. And so an athlete who does lose her period just wants to make sure to check with her doctor and know that everything's okay with her body.
I'm doing what you call as a stereotype in the book, and that's I'm referring to she, and this is not just a she problem, is it?
No, it's not. Actually, the fastest growing population of those experiencing anorexia nervosa is teenage boys. And while the predominance of people with anorexia, about 85 to 90%, are still female, we see that cases of male anorexia and cases of male eating disorders in general are fast increasing. And as a matter of fact, with binge eating disorder, about 50%, so a full half of cases of binge eating disorder we find in males.
You're listening to This Week in America, website thisweekinamerica.us. Our guest on the program, Dr. Sari Fine Shepherd, author of the book 100 Questions and Answers about Anorexia Nervosa. The book is available all across the country, available online. Her website is drshep.com, drshep.com. Once you think you might see a warning sign, and let's say it's your son or daughter, how do you approach that? Because sometimes they don't want to hear, oh, Mom, Dad, there's nothing wrong, everything is fine, and they're probably trying to shield it from you anyway. What's the next step once you realize there could be a problem here?
Sure. Well, that's a great question, because I think it's very important for people to feel as comfortable as possible just going ahead and making that initial approach to check in and see what's going on. Because even if there's not an eating disorder involved, some of these early warning signs that I mentioned can be a sign of depression or stress or anxiety. So it's a great idea just for parents to check in with their kids. And I would just offer a few things to keep in mind. One is just to speak to your child in private, not to make a big announcement at the family table that they're concerned that there might be a serious problem, because this can lead to further isolation in the child. But just to let your child or your loved one know what you're concerned about, talk about the specific behaviors that you've observed that led to your concern, and then just invite them to discuss what perhaps is going on in their life. Are they experiencing greater stress? Is there trouble going on at school? Are they concerned about something with their future or anticipating some sort of stress? Just to voice your concern in a loving manner and express your support for that loved one. Just remind them that the reason you're mentioning anything at all is because of your concern for their well-being. So it doesn't have to be a confrontation. There doesn't have to be any accusation, just a show of love and support.
Got about a minute and a half left here, and I want to wrap up in talking about Anna. I mentioned that she thought she had it beaten, and it came back, and she unfortunately ended up losing her life because of it. When you think you've got it beaten, how often do you relapse? What do you need to watch for?
That's a great question, because relapse can be quite common with severe cases of eating disorders, both with anorexia as well as bulimia. And the things that we watch for with relapse are the same sort of warning signs that we watch for the onset of an eating disorder. So again, if someone begins to weigh themselves again more frequently, if they begin to make negative comments about their body, if you see them begin to restrict their food, if they have food rituals that they engage in, perhaps only eating at a certain time of day or eating a certain kind of food and restricting their food choices, if we see some of these same early warning signs, those are also signs of potential relapse. And about 25% of people who have anorexia will recover but then continue to have symptoms throughout their lifetime. So there's about a quarter of people with anorexia who sort of maintain a high risk for relapse. But the good news is that the majority of people with anorexia do recover and make a full recovery. Unfortunately for the Weston family, that wasn't the case with Anna, and there is that risk of serious harm and even death. But for the most part, the majority of people with anorexia, if they get early treatment especially, they have a great chance of full recovery.
It's an excellent book, an important book, 100 Questions and Answers about Anorexia Nervosa. The author is our guest on the program, Dr. Sari Fine Shepherd. Her website is drshep.com, DRSHEPP.com. You've been listening to This Week in America on the Blue Funk Broadcasting Radio Network. Our website, and you can link on to get information on Dr. Shepherd's book, is very simple, thisweekinamerica.us.